The Lighthouse, by Robert Eggers, is a psychological horror movie set in 1890, following two lighthouse keepers on a remote island. Our keepers, referred to as Wickies in the film, are Thomas and Ephraim, Thomas being an older and experienced Wickie, Ephraim being younger and having this job for the first time. Over the course of the movie, both Thomas and Ephraim struggle to maintain their sanity and fail, leading to both their deaths. But what exactly did our two Wickies struggle with? Let's go find out, starting with our main character, Ephraim. At the start, we are introduced to our main characters as they meet each other over a meal, Ephraim and Thomas. Ephraim is a new Wickie in training, while Thomas is his supervisor. Right off the bat, Ephraim is uneasy and strangely cautious around Thomas, which I believe is mild paranoia. But why paranoia and not just plain suspicion? To be fair, anyone can be jumpy in a new environment. Well, actually, not only does he exhibit symptoms, but there's multiple factors that could be causing those symptoms within him. The first cause would be his recent trauma, an incident with his previous supervisor, which ended in the supervisor dead. The guilt from this event, which I'll refer to as the Winslow incident and will be explaining further soon, is likely weighing on Ephraim's soul and making him believe everyone is against him. On top of that, it's likely Ephraim has had a long history of mistreatment, as he is a lower-class worker who commonly works under abusive managers. Ephraim even actually talks about being verbally abused as he opens up to Thomas, and likens it to how Thomas treats him. We also observe Ephraim to be a smoker very early on, which could play a small role in worsening his paranoia. Now, we've established it's possible that he has mild paranoia right at the beginning, but how does this paranoia present itself? Early on, we see that Ephraim is an insomniac that wanders the island late at night, and when he does sleep, is prone to nightmares. He has one about a corpse and the siren, which makes him begin to consider the possibility that Thomas is a siren. After this, Ephraim is constantly suspicious of Thomas, and begins to probe about what happened to the previous Wickie, while also keeping an eye on Thomas when he can't sleep. And by keeping an eye on, I mean standing outside his room and staring at Thomas while he works. But as the story progresses, this mild paranoia begins to morph into something worse. The first sign of Ephraim getting worse is when his paranoia prompts him to spy on Thomas as he works, causing Ephraim to hallucinate a tentacle slithering around in the lighthouse. Ephraim hallucinates many times throughout the film, and here, it's likely a product of the social isolation of being on the island, mixing with trauma, paranoia, and substance abuse. From this point on, we begin to observe aggressive mood swings in Ephraim. A notable example being when Ephraim kills a seagull by grabbing it and slamming it until it's unrecognizable. It's a brutal scene, and it's followed up by Ephraim switching back to being placid and doing his work as usual. The mood swings, like the hallucinations, are probably caused by 1. Social isolation, 2. Paranoia, 3. Trauma, and 4. Smoking. It is around this time that a new factor is introduced, alcohol, as Thomas is finally able to convince Ephraim to drink with him. And when Ephraim drinks, he downs his cups as fast as Thomas, who, by the way, is a seasoned alcoholic. This leads me to believe that Ephraim was likely a recovering alcoholic, which means withdrawals have probably been worsening his paranoia, hallucinations, and mood swings up until now. But Ephraim doesn't just drink once. After Thomas convinces him to once, Ephraim begins drinking as heavily and as frequently as Thomas does. The alcohol, combined with the overtime worsening of his current conditions, are affecting him more and more, And we see this when Ephraim's next hallucination of a siren is so vivid and terrifying that he stops in the middle of his tasks just to scream. A scream which is so long and loud that Thomas asks him about it afterwards. It's possible that the fact that Ephraim is repeatedly hallucinating sirens, who are beautiful, seductive creatures, is a representation of the loneliness being on the island causes him. One day, when Ephraim is working, Thomas calls him over to tell him they have to start rationing now that it's clear that no one is coming to check up on them. Ephraim offers to take the dory out and go check once more to see if anyone is on their way, which is when Thomas snaps and he yells at Ephraim that it's been weeks since when anyone was supposed to come. Weeks since Ephraim has been saying that. Weeks since they've had to start rationing. Ephraim struggles to accept this and is obviously very confused. It seems as if Ephraim is having a hard time grasping reality, making this instance a small delusion, which means that Ephraim may be experiencing early psychosis. It's clear Ephraim is getting worse, with another sign of it being when he pockets a knife during his nightly drinking with Thomas. This is a result of his paranoia, which at this point has escalated from mild to bad enough for Ephraim to believe he might need to defend himself against Thomas. The fact that Thomas doesn't let Ephraim tend to the light fuels Ephraim's suspicion, so much so that he tries to steal the key to the light and fails. From this point on, we observe Ephraim gradually becoming more and more unstable. He's been drinking insane amounts, acting erratically, and after finding what looked like a human head, Ephraim's paranoia about Thomas is at a boiling point. In direct spite of this, Ephraim is also confessing his trauma to Thomas, claiming that he trusts him. These contradictory emotions toward the same person could be due to clashing loneliness and paranoia. Ephraim wants company, but is afraid of the only other person on the island. During his confession, we learn about the Winslow incident. At Ephraim's previous woodcutting job, there was a supervisor named Winslow who was especially cruel to him. So when Winslow had a life-threatening accident on the job, Ephraim stood by and watched. Afterwards, Ephraim adopted the name Ephraim Winslow and had been working odd jobs here and there ever since. As he tells the story, Ephraim repeatedly accuses Thomas of forcing him to open up, which is, again, paranoia. Before, Ephraim had just found the head, but now, he stumbled upon the rest of the body. As he registers his finding, a naked version of Thomas with glowing eyes appears behind him and chases him, and I'm going to interpret this as a representation of Ephraim's paranoia and what he believes Thomas will do to him. This didn't cause a confrontation, but Ephraim uncovering Thomas's logbook did. In the logbook, Thomas had written that Ephraim was aggressive and a poor worker, which sends Ephraim spiraling. It's true that both Ephraim and Thomas are unreliable, but I believe that Thomas is a lot more sane than Ephraim is. Therefore, I'm going to take the logbook as the truth. After yelling at Thomas about the logbook, Ephraim switches to begging to see the light, and when he's denied it, Ephraim attacks Thomas. Not just a straight punch, but full-on wrestling him to the ground and pounding his face until Thomas has passed out. In between punches, Ephraim hallucinates different faces in the place of Thomas's, such as that of a siren or a sea monster. This marks Ephraim's point of no return, as he has gotten significantly worse in the span of one breakdown. We now witness the buildup of Ephraim's paranoia, loneliness, trauma, mistreatment, substance abuse, and at this point, psychosis, as it now takes over and Ephraim becomes incredibly unstable and violent. He doesn't stop at beating Thomas once, but forces him to behave like a dog, and then buries him alive. eventually murdering him with an axe after Thomas initially survives. And to what end? Ephraim finally has the opportunities to see the light, and after spending a very happy but neurotic moment with it, falls down the stairs to his death, which is where Ephraim's story ends. Just to recap, we start with a Ephraim who experiences mild paranoia and hallucinations due to a history of trauma, abuse, substance abuse, and withdrawals. Over the course of the film, this worsens due to added factors of loneliness and alcohol abuse. By the end, we conclude with a Ephraim who is severely paranoid and psychotic. I'm satisfied with my personal assessment, but if you believe that Ephraim has something else going on, feel free to explain yourself in the comments. I love to see how else you can interpret his behavior. But for now, let's move on to Thomas. Out of the two, Thomas is definitely more sane, but that doesn't mean he's without his flaws. He is oftentimes verbally abusive towards Ephraim, in a way that Ephraim himself says makes him feel like a dog. Hence the whole bit about forcing Thomas to behave like a dog once Ephraim loses it. More than that, Thomas has a tendency to ignore Ephraim's boundaries and force him to comply to his own whims, which is best exemplified by Thomas forcing Ephraim to drink until he finally folds. He himself has a severe drinking problem, and throughout the course of the film, it just gets worse and worse. Thomas also has a problem with compulsive lying. He repeatedly lies about his life and makes up stories about the adventures he's had. When Ephraim catches him in these lies, Thomas simply ignores him. But these are all issues unrelated to his mind, and instead these deal with his personality. So, does that mean that Ephraim is utterly insane and Thomas is fine? No, not at all. The reason Ephraim is fixated on gaining access to the light is because Thomas believes he's married to the light. This delusion of his causes him to be possessive over the light, refusing to let any man near it. It isn't particularly dangerous until Ephraim actually gets close to the light, which is when Thomas attempts to axe murder him. It's possible that Thomas killed his previous fellow Wickie for the same reason. Now, what caused his delusion? Fascinatingly, it has something to do with the nature of lighthouses back in the day. In order to make the light easier to maneuver, they used to be submerged in a bath of mercury, which often drove the keeper mad or caused other health issues. Since Thomas is the only one tending the light, it's extremely likely that mercury poisoning is what drove him to his delusion. Loneliness could have also played a part in shaping the delusion, as Thomas mentions leaving behind his wife to work this job, and he's worked many years on the island, away from civilization. Despite being delusional and a mean old man, Thomas is more stable than Ephraim is throughout most of the movie, which is why I believe his logbook entries and when he says that it's been weeks of Ephraim talking about taking the dory out. At one point, Ephraim reveals his name isn't Ephraim at all. It's Tommy, which is the same name as the other man he's living in the lighthouse with. But is that other man really so other? Time and time again, the movie has us question whether Thomas and Ephraim are even two real people. But does this idea hold up to scrutiny? Let's see. At about an hour in, Thomas confronts Ephraim about his declining sanity and presents him with the possibility that he is merely a figment of his imagination, which not only implies they're the same person, but if they are, Ephraim is becoming aware of it. There are a couple other oddball scenes which fit perfectly into this narrative. The first one is when Ephraim and Thomas are sitting in their beds in silence, when all of a sudden, they start a yelling contest where they go what at each other repeatedly. Here, You could say their matched levels of neuroticism point towards them being just two sides of the same coin, and that the scene here is an interaction between those two sides. Or take the scene when Ephraim stumbles across the body of the previous wiki, which prompts Thomas, naked, to appear and suddenly chase him. Thomas only appears as Ephraim discovers the body, hinting that maybe his existence is tied to Ephraim. Outside of evidence presented in these scenes, you could argue on the basis of their relationship. If you look at Thomas's character and personality, which is of an abusive man who holds power over Ephraim, you realize it's an archetype which Ephraim has likely encountered many times in his life. So it would make sense for that type of second voice to emerge within him when he begins to experience psychosis. Despite all this, I personally don't believe they're the same person, since none of the evidence I presented thus far would realistically work. There simply isn't an explanation for how they'd be the same, and the theory quickly falls apart under further scrutiny. The first explanation for them being the same is that Ephraim suffers from DID, which I don't believe he does. When a person is suffering from DID, they usually only represent one personality at a time. But Thomas and Ephraim are almost always on screen at the same time, immediately ruling that possibility out. The next plausible explanation is that Ephraim is hallucinating Thomas, but this is extremely flawed too. Thomas appears as soon as Ephraim steps foot on the island, but Ephraim's mental state isn't bad enough to be having such vivid and constant hallucinations yet. Maybe as time progresses and Ephraim mentally degrades further, yes, but for Thomas to be a product of that, he'd have to appear much, much later in the film alongside Ephraim's psychosis. On top of that, it's far more likely that a first-time wiki would be working with a more experienced one, and lighthouses typically need more than one person to maintain, making it even more likely that Ephraim isn't alone and making up Thomas's existence. Because of all this, I'm going to conclude that no, they are not the same person. But if you feel differently, feel free to come debate me on this in the comments. I'd be curious to see what more could be said on this. The Lighthouse was an amazing watch, and it beautifully weaves psychology, horror, antiquity, and good cinematography together into something truly terrific. Take that in both senses of the word. Overall, I highly recommend it. Again, I'm satisfied with my analysis of both Ephraim and Thomas, but if you disagree or have something to add, I encourage you to comment below your thoughts.